today I'm going to, of course, wrap up my last lecture on the Middle Ages. Pretty much our topics today are going to be, well, I'll talk about the rise of the Mongols and all these different, states that kind of emerge afterwards due to like the Mongol Empire that forms. So I'll talk about that today. I'll also talk about the late Middle Ages. I'm going to get into talk about the Black Death, one of the main things, of course, I'll get to today. 100 Years' War. I'll talk about that was kind of a major conflict that happened in the Middle Ages. That's real well known. Then I'll talk about one of the most famous things in the late Middle Ages, of course. See a lot of paintings like in the back, like Mona Lisa, the Renaissance, probably the most famous thing. So we'll get to that. So if you have any comments, questions about this lecture or previous lectures, let me know, of course, on my YouTube channel. Or if you got, like I said, a comment or something, a question about the class, just you can email me pretty much later. Here, of course, the link to StreamYard.com, of course, if you want to join me also as well. So anyway, from last lecture, of course, at part 2, of course, on the Middle Ages, I had discussed primarily some of the major events that happened like in the central part of the Middle Ages, like the rise of the so-called Viking Age, I think was one of the things that we got gone into. And then I did talk about the Crusades. The Crusades is probably one of the most famous events that happened in the Middle Age. I'd say Crusades and the Renaissance, those two things, the biggest ones that happened. So yeah, I'm going to move on to talk about also the Mongols that are kind of pretty famous, that kind of appear, during the kind of I guess the middle or later part of the Middle Ages that you get that comes in. The Mongols was an empire that kind of formed in the 13th century, and it's around to like the 14th century. And I think afterwards, there's actually these various relic type states that kind of survive afterwards that exist at one point. You can see Genghis Khan there, of course, one of the founders of it. That's well known. The Mongols are pretty famous for a lot of things. They changed pretty much the world a lot, especially in Europe and Asia, especially demographically, which I'll kind of explain about that a little later. But yeah, it was one of the largest empires ever in history at one point. I think they say that the Mongol Empire may have been almost like 10 million square miles. I think the only thing that's close to it is probably the British Empire, which you can see reached maybe 12, 13 million square miles at one point, probably up to the 19th, 20th century. So that's kind of amazing right there if you think about how large the Mongol Empire was. I do have maps showing you the Mongol Empire, like the spread of it and all that, which I can kind of show you right here. But you can see it was a type of empire that started obviously in Mongolia. So these are Mongolian Asiatic peoples that basically spread from Mongolia into like China, took over China and East Asia, Korea also as well. They spread westward into Tibet. You can see they went all the way into Russia at one point, even got into parts of northern India, Pakistan, Persia at one point, Iraq. You can see they think at one point that the Mongols may have actually reached all the way to, you can see here, Poland and Hungary, far west they got. It's pretty amazing. That's amazing how far west they got at one point, almost reaching like the Byzantine Empire, over here in the Mediterranean Sea. So obviously that was something that they're kind of, well known for. Of course, we talked about, the founder of, the Mongol Empire, which of course was Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan's more of a title that he went by, which means, it usually means a universal ruler, kind of like emperor, that's kind of what it meant. But his real name was Temujin, and he formed the bulk of the empire in the early part of the 13th century. And his forces, of course, eventually would, I think he conquered, I want to say 80% or more of the empire at one point through his campaigns, east to west, across parts of Eurasia. They also say Chinggis Khan, I think, is the common way they say it, like in Mongolia, of course, today also as well. Hey, Daph, what's going on also this morning? as well. Also, they had different nicknames that the Mongols were also called as well. A lot of people call them the Devil's Horsemen. I don't know if you know about that. Devil's Horsemen. They often fought on horseback, practically lived on the horse, the Mongols. And they call it Devil's Horsemen because a lot of people thought they were sent by the devil or whatever to punish them, especially I think Christians, I think, more or less later kind of give them that name. They're often called the Mongol horde. The term horde was often used because a lot of the Mongols would divide themselves up into tribal groups called a horde, since the name being used. Well, use that was often a common term. They used Mongol horde being used. Russia, they called the Golden Horde, was another name they got because they were forced to pay like a lot of money to like gold tribute to, I guess, prevent them from sacking their people and all that. But that is one thing that they're very famous for, the Mongols. The Mongols committed mass genocide as they went from pretty much east to west across Asia and Europe. They created a lot of great demographic change. And of course, they were known for mass genocide, where they just wiped out hundreds of cities and villages, just killed everybody in their wake. I've got like 30, 40 million they think that possibly the Mongol invasions may have actually caused. But I see some numbers as high as like 50 to 60 million. There's even a theory that the Mongol invasions of Asia and Europe may have caused the world population to drop by 10 to 11%, which is amazing. It's like almost in comparison with the Black Death that wiped out a lot of people too, also as well. So that's something that they're very famous for, committing mass genocide as they conquered vast amounts of territory throughout those regions. Now, the only thing that happened, though, I think if you study about after Genghis Khan died, it was kind of like a civil war among his sons and all that. And what happened later, his empire eventually broke up. Here's kind of a map showing the basically the empire itself as it expanded. In fact, here's one map showing you the expansion of the empire as it got bigger and bigger. I think that kind of shows you right there. But kind of you can see it kind of expands over time right there. But this map here shows you more or less the areas that it would eventually break up into, which would be like these four Khanates that'll form later, so-called Mongol Khanates. A Khan, by the way, was what they called their leaders. The word Khan meant leader, or I don't know, maybe it meant like kind of like a king, basically. Great Khan, I think, was the common term they would use, like for leaders like Genghis Khan and so on. So it means great, I guess, great leader, basically. That's what it means. And you can see there's four of them. They got the Khanate of the Great Khan, which was sometimes called the Yuan dynasty or Yuan state, which is mostly China, Mongolia, which was over here. They got the Khanate of the Golden Horde in Russia, Ukraine. The Chagatai Khanate, which here are kind of like in like that central part of Asia here above India. And then yeah, the Il Khanate also state in like around Persia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, in those areas. So that's kind of the areas that they kind of break it up over time. The ones that are the most famous they had, though, was the Yuan one I'm talking about. Of course, that one was famously founded by Genghis Khan's grandson, you may have heard of, named Kublai Khan, who became emperor of China. So he kind of created this imperial China because like in the 1220s, I think it was, the Mongols attacked through the Great Wall and took over China between the 13th and the 14th centuries right there. And Kublai Khan ruled as emperor from like about 1271 to 1294. First non-Han emperor, by the way. They hadn't really had any other emperors that weren't from Han Chinese. So you have the Mongols ruling as emperors for a short time there, believe it or not. So they controlled China, Mongolia, and also Korea. And I think Kublai Khan also tried to attack Japan, crossing the Sea of Japan, but he was his forces were wiped out by some kind of bad storms, like a cyclones or something like that. Hey, Nat, We're having a great morning also as well. So yeah, they had that. Then also you said one that's kind of that yellow area that they had as well. Kind of mentioned about that one as well. They also had the one that's called the Golden Horde Khanate. This was a Russian Khanate that was founded by Batu Khan, who was one of Genghis Khan's grandsons that kind of attacked westward towards like Russia and the Ukraine, and eventually they sacked Kiev at one point, the capital of one of their main cities in the Ukraine. And what happened was interesting about a lot of these states, especially in the western part of the Mongol Empire. If you know about the Mongols, came into contact with Turkish peoples, and the two cultures kind of synthesized or assimilated into each other. So you get this Turco-Mongol culture that kind of merges, and even the Mongols become later Muslim a lot, especially in the West and all that. And anyway, in Russia they call them Tatars, if you know about that. And so they talk about the Tatar yoke and all that controls Russia. And I think in Russia they call them the Golden Horde because of the fact that they were forced to pay them like gold tribute. But they say it's also because the Tatars lived in these golden colored tents, hence the name being used also as well. Hey, Markel, I hope you're having a great morning also out there as well. So yeah, that's the kind of like the Mongols, how they kind of, create all this chaos in different states afterwards. And you get different states that kind of break away afterwards. Like there's one that's real famous that kind of broke away from the Khanates. There's of course a statue of Genghis Khan right there you're looking at, but they have this one that was called the Timurid or Tamerlane's Empire that formed later, which was a Turco-Mongol state, where the Turks and Mongols kind of merged together. Also the Persian people also as well kind of mixed in there too as well. They all three kind of mix those cultures. We get this new empire that forms in the 14th century, which the ruler that formed it was a man named, here's a picture of him right there, but his name was Timur, who was also called Tamerlane, was his other name he went by. So I think it was a slur of the name Timur the Lame, because he walked with like a limp. So I guess must have been a war wound or something like that. And so that's where the name Tamerlane came from over time. And he was this warlord and Turco-Mongol type political leader, I guess, that controlled most of like the Middle East from like Iraq into Iran. And he controlled some territory all the way to the Indus River, like around Afghanistan, Pakistan. And so, and that's kind of why, you get, Islam spread eastward over time, because you get these different empires that exist there. And that they say that the Timurid Empire is what led to the Mughal Empire forming later as well. The Mughal Empire, which will kind of break away from that, he'll kind of birth it. And Mughal Empire was this empire that controlled most of India later. It was established later, not more like in the early, this might get more into the early modern times, the Mughal Empire, but that's an empire that they do think was somehow descended from the Turco-Mongol cultures, because you've got Babur, who was the guy that founded the Mughal Empire in the 1520s, and he was actually descended of, basically, you have Timur on one side, through his father, which I guess was the, Turks. And then you got Genghis Khan through his mother with the Mongols that you have. So they'll go in there and control it. And Mughal Empire's in there for a while. They control at one point India up to like the 19th century. But because of the Europeans coming in, like the British and so on, that caused their empire later to decline. And the British Empire would have, of course, a major effect on that part of the world, like in South Asia. So all these were kind of like these, derivative states that kind of formed, after, the Mongols and what they did throughout most of like Asia, etc. Right, I'm going to move on to talk about some of the major events that, of course, occurred in the Middle Ages. I want to talk about. I want to get into. We'll discuss some of these topics. Of course, I've got up there. Like the Black Death is one of the big things I'll talk about first. We'll get into that. Then I'll talk about the 100 Years' War. You can see kind of Joan of Arc in that picture there. Of course, I've got. Then I'll get into the Renaissance. Renaissance, of course, the most famous event that really happened in the later part of the Middle Ages. And the outbreak of the bubonic plague. That's one thing that's real famous, about, the late Middle Ages, which, if you know much about the Black Death, it was this massive pandemic that killed millions in parts of Europe, Asia, they think also North Africa as well. Really started like around the 1340s and into the 1350s, but it was a type of pandemic that was around up to modern times. I think up to like the 19th century, I know it was kind of a problem. And they say it killed more people in history than any other plague. Well, I think when they say plague, they mean pretty much bubonic plague, more or less. Here's an estimate, but they think that it could have. They said in the video 50 million, but I think there's some theories back in history, like world history in general, that the plague may have killed anywhere from 100 to 200 million people worldwide. So you can go all the way back to the time of like the Greeks and the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire under Justinian. So there's been multiple times where the bubonic plague may have killed people in history. So all the way up from it's up to like maybe the 1800s in modern times, more or less. And in Europe, they think it may have killed 25 million people, so much that it may have killed like anywhere from like a third of the population to maybe even close to a half of the population wiped out. So whole villages were just totally destroyed, by the plague as it ravished different parts of it. There's different maps showing the spread of the plague that they always talk about. They'll kind of share with you, but they think the plague likely originated somewhere in Asia. I think Central Asia has been kind of a theory of where it came from, maybe even China. A lot of different illnesses have originated in China, like the swine flu, something COVID, they think originated, from China also as well. A lot of it came from east to west because of trade routes, like the Silk Road that ran, westward toward the Middle East in the Black Sea. Also, the Mongols helped spread it too. Also, as they conquered east to west, they brought the plague with them. In fact, the Mongols would often use bodies, like dead bodies with plague, to wipe out cities. They would actually catapult them into people's like cities and stuff like that, to kind of like germ warfare to basically kill off full populations. So they obviously knew something about it. But you can see how the plague they think crept through the ports. So they think it was caused by they think what happened was, of course, spread by black rats. Black rats was the common carrier of the plague, with the rat flea carrying it in their stomach, the bacterium. And they think that most Italian trading ships, like from the Genoese, I think being the main ones, brought the plague from the Black Sea region to Italy, and then from there it spread northward through Europe, is what happened. They talked about the different, what caused it, and all, like the cause of the plague and all that, which I told you most of it was caused by, of course, rats that spread through fleas. And of course, they talked about in the video how there was this bacterium in the flea's stomach called Yersinia pestis, which was actually named after this doctor. I think it was a Swiss-French doctor named Alexander Yersin, who discovered it in 1896. I think he was working for the Pasteur Institute or something like that, and discovered what caused it and all that. And so, but back then people didn't know that, like what caused, the actual plague and all that. But the symptoms of the plague, of course, vary, but the main ones that they talk about that are, of course, famous are the famous bobos that they would get around their neck, around their groin area, around their armpits, which would, bleed like pus and blood. So that was like one of the main things. They would get extreme pain, black spots or blotches on the skin, like the skin would really like rot and die off. So that's kind of why they call it a Black Death, also later a Black Plague. Violent coughing of blood and things like that were all often other causes. And I think they said it could spread different ways. Like there's different ways that the plague could spread, like through the air, through contact, and respiratory, ways, droplets and things like that were different ways that it could spread, that you could actually get it, more or less. The Catholic Church believed that about 23 million may have died from the actual plague. So that might be close, 20, 25 million might be the actual amount, which might be true. Here's a kind of a bobo, of course, people would get like on their, like back of their neck and things like that. And people still use that today. Like when they get like I still use it sometimes. I get like a little cut or something. Oh, I got a little bobo on me. That's kind of where that, of course, comes from, more or less. Now, medieval people, they had different names for the plague. They didn't call it Black Death or Black Plague or Bubonic Plague. Those are more modern names that started to be used later. The common names they used were the Great Pestilence, was something they used. Great Mortality, which obviously means great death because of the amount of people that died. Of course, some people think it was called Black Death because of the amount of people that died, like all the people that were wiped out, of course, by the plague. It's not really till the 17th century that you really have, the name or nickname Black Death or Black Plague really being used. I think by the time of the Great Plague of London, which happened 1665, 1666, which killed 100,000 or more people, like in England, I think they started using it then. But plague, it affected, like if you study about Napoleon's troops when they invaded Egypt in 1798, some of his forces were actually riddled with bubonic plague. So it's quite common, like I said, up to like close to the 19th century of people getting it. What did medieval people believe that caused the plague? Well, there's all kinds of things that they think caused the plague. I kind of got a list of them right here, but some blame God. The fact that they weren't going to church, things like that. So they thought God was punishing them for their sins, things like that. The devil, like Satan, was behind it, causing all these people to die. Lack of religion, you see there, of course, was a big one they talked about a lot. The Jews, a lot of people blamed the Jews. They thought the Jews had poisoned the wells, and that's why people were dying. And so a lot of Jews were killed during the Black Death because they thought they were behind it. Witchcraft, demon stuff, dealing with demons and bad spirits. Those were also causes too. So you start to see witch hunts in Europe take off. A lot of women were accused of maybe causing bubonic plague, things like that. Astrology was a lot of the scholars, like at University of Paris and other famous, colleges at the time in modern Europe, thought that maybe there was a conjunction of the planets where the planets had lined up a certain way, and that had caused the plague also. The closest theory that people got to the plague, which was very popular, by the way, was the miasma theory, which was this belief that if you breathe in bad air, like foul air, like smell it, that it'll make you ill. And so that's why people started wearing all these masks that you start seeing during the Black Death. They're kind of like these beak-looking masks, like this one right here that you're looking at. And they thought they put scents or flowers in there that smelled good. They didn't smell like the smell of dead bodies and all that. They wouldn't get the plague. But of course, they wore the mask and they died anyway. So the masks really don't stop the actual, germs going through it. So because there's unless you got something that kind of can stop it, but it's going to go right through it. So later, of course, they abandoned that theory. I think by the late 1800s, they figure out that most illnesses are caused by germ theory. Germs causing it, bacteria, viruses, and other things like that today. So back then they didn't know that. What actually caused it, and they didn't know about the rats and the rat fleas, being the carriers of it. But I think they say that the black rat was one of the main rats that carried it, like the rat fleas, whatever. But the brown rat later became the dominant rat later in Europe. And so that helped to kind of, eventually cause its decline, I think they say. All right. Anyway, I want to get into next, I want to talk about as well, one of the major events that's real famous in, of course, really in the late Middle Ages is the 100 Years' War. That, of course, was a major conflict that occurred that really changed Europe quite a lot. The 100 Years' War was a major war that was fought between England and France. Considered one of the bloodiest conflicts in the Middle Ages, probably top 5. I don't think it was the bloodiest, but it was one of the top 5 bloodiest conflicts, possibly causing somewhere between 2 to 3 million people dead, like in the conflict, which was mostly fought in France, where it was fought. And it's one of the longest wars in medieval history. You can see 1337 to 1453. They weren't fighting like the whole time. I think it's like 116 years, I think, off and on. But it was like a series of wars that were fought between both sides. And what caused the war was the fact that you had these two rival dynasties that wanted to control all of France. The two dynasties, by the way, were the House of Valois, which controlled France, the Kingdom of France and all that, and the House of the Plantagenet dynasty, which was sometimes called Angevin, by the way, as well, which was English. Those were pretty famous dynasties in the Middle Ages. Valois was a new dynasty which had replaced the Capetian dynasty because one of the last kings of that dynasty had died, and they had what caused the war to break out. There was a dynastic dispute over the French throne. The king of France, who was Charles IV, had died. He was the last major ruler of the Capetian dynasty, which went all the way back to Hugh Capet, who was like one of the first kings of what they call the Kingdom of France, formed, I think, around the 10th century. And he had a nephew named King Edward III of England, who basically sought the throne because he was like the closest heir. But he didn't want to give it to him. He gave it, I think, to another nephew. And so that's what caused the war. Now, if you look at this map of, I think I've got a map showing you of like France at the time. One of the territories up here they fought over was Aquitaine. Aquitaine, I think, was believed to be one of the main areas that really caused the war. The English still controlled some territory in France. They controlled Calais, around Calais, up here. Sarah Bordeaux is around Aquitaine. They controlled this area as well. And basically, the French didn't want the English to control that. And so they say that's what caused the war to break out. It was like the flashpoint that really, caused, the 100 Years' War to break out. And the wars actually went through a series of conflicts. It was like, I think, 3 stages of the war at one point, where they have the Edwardian part of the war, where Edward, would fight King Edward III, and I think there's the Caroline War too, which was like where the King Charles VI and VII of France fought against the English, and they had the Lancastrian, of course, stage of the war, where the Lancastrian kings and, of course, in England fought also as well. So kind of goes through a lot of stages, multiple generations, fighting in the 100 Years' War and all that. And it did have a lot of major implications, not just in between France and England, but it did affect Europe overall afterwards. Now, talk about as well technology, because that's one thing that's well known, about the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War is one of those first wars that really changed warfare. They think that, in a sense, that it induced like new weapons, technology in the war. Another thing about the 100 Years' War, 100 Years' War was considered like one of the first modernized wars, where You have like new kinds of weapons being introduced, like the so-called cannon is introduced into the war, which I think was being developed already, like in the Ottoman Empire in the East, in China. Gunpowder weapons, firearms, start coming in. Later they have the arquebus, of course, will happen later. Will have, but also feudal warfare will kind of come to an end. You'll start seeing, in medieval times, they mostly had knights on horseback fighting a lot, with nobility mostly doing all the fighting in the Middle Ages. But you'll start seeing like peasants, starting to fight other social classes and things like that. And that also changes a lot of warfare as well. The English introduced a new weapon during the 100 Years' War, which gave them a lot of advantages, which is the longbow. It was a new type of bow and arrow that could fire arrows at a longer distance. And it was a major advantage, especially against, mounted cavalry. And they could just hire peasants basically to, fire arrows at them. And it was a major effect in some of the battles. In fact, a lot of the early battles, like Battle of Crécy, Battle of Poitiers, Battle of Agincourt in 1450, were major, strategic battles that England used to take control of, especially northern France, I know, in the war. And so a lot of these new kinds of weaponry were kind of an advantage in the war. I think England had better military than the French had, and better leadership also as well, especially early on. So you can see that the longbow being used right there. Here's, of course, the longbow, being used by a bunch of archers right there. Also, other types of weapons too. You may have heard of, like the French developed various siege engines, like the Trebuchet. You're looking at. Which the trebuchet is a type of catapult that could fire projectiles like 300-400 yards, which could take out fortified walls, castles, things like that. So that was kind of another weapon that was kind of used by both sides in the war. And that also kind of helped to make a lot of fortifications and castles kind of obsolete. But that's before they have cannons, and then they started having cannons, and that's eventually going to make a lot of those kind of things obsolete over time eventually. So those are other things that kind of help to modernize warfare. They'll start using armor and things like that, but they're using too. But I think a lot of that kind of goes away eventually. Now, also, I'll kind of talk about the turning point in the war, which if you go up to like 1415, the Battle of Agincourt, the English were winning the war. They'd almost taken over almost half of France at that point. Even take a lot of the major cities like Paris had fallen. Pretty much the English. If you look at this map here, they kind of show you this kind of the stages that the war kind of goes into right here. But you can see here, like up, see the beginning of the war right here. But if you go like over here, they took control of this area here at one point, which they lost later. But by the early part of the 15th century, you can see here they've taken pretty much northern France from Brittany, Normandy, the Champagne area of France. So they control a lot of the major cities. Paris, Rouen were also controlled by them. Reims was also controlled. And they're also trying to take Orleans, also right here, which is another major city in the north that was important. And so, however, they think that the war kind of changed because of Joan of Arc. She's often considered, one of the major influences that really changes the outcome of the war. Joan of Arc, was a very famous woman in French history, like modern French times, and she's known as Jeanne d'Arc, which of course in the West they call it Joan of Arc, as you know, often known as the so-called Maid of Orleans. And she was this young woman who was a teenager that had visions where she was visited by, I think, one of the archangels, Saint Michael, and a few other saints, and she was told to aid the king of France, which I think at the time was Charles VII, or actually he wasn't even crowned. I think that was one thing about him. Of course, we know about he was the Dauphin, or the ruler that needed to be crowned. And so she's important. Joan of Arc is important in aiding Charles VII, his military forces, in lifting the siege of Orleans, or really Orleans, so they say it. And they think that was important. The siege of Orleans is the watershed moment or event, turning point, of the whole 100 Years' War, when the French were able to overcome that siege and retake the city. From there, it kind of helped to rally the French against the English. Then from there, as you know, what happened after that was the French basically rolled up the English, and basically within 20, 30 years, they retook most of France, minus, I think, Calais was about it. So she's definitely considered to be, a hero that's really important with modern France today. Later, as you know, she was captured and put on trial. She was put on trial for mostly heresy. I think they accused her of also witchcraft as well, and she was burned at the stake, is what happened to her at the age of 19 in 1431. But later on, the Catholic Church, as you know, made her into a saint in 1920. So she's kind of been canonized and all that by the Catholic Church, etc. So why is the 100 Years War important? Well, the 100 Years War is very important because the fact that it kind of creates an independent, French and English states. They'll kind of separate from each other afterwards. Both states become very nationalized, as you know, and the rivalry is there afterwards. Pretty much England and France are major rivals throughout modern times, even up to like the time of Napoleon, etc. So that's something that's constantly there. And even today, France and England are still, rivals. I think mostly it's in sports now, like football or rugby or whatever it is. You still got that going on, but I think the 100 Years' War kind of contributed to change, Europe overall, like warfare. I think it changed a lot of international diplomacy between countries afterwards because of the fact that the war was so awful, more or less. All right, I'm also going to move on today. Of course, the last thing I'll talk about is the so-called Renaissance. So I did want to get into that and mention about that as well, because the Renaissance was obviously the most famous event, really, of the whole Middle Age, especially the late Middle Ages, which you can see it peaked between the 13th, 14th centuries, kind of when it gets started, and it goes all the way up to like about the 16th century. They think up to like 1500s at least. It kind of may have affected Europe at one point. What exactly was the Renaissance? I've got kind of a definition of it for you, but it was a kind of an intellectual, cultural type movement that started in Europe, started in Italy, originally, like northern Italy mostly. It's where it began. A lot of their cities like Florence, you may have heard of, Genoa, Venice, started in Rome as well. And it was a transitional period, but between like the Middle Age, Dark Ages that we talked about, and the modern times that come in. So a lot of historians think the Renaissance was kind of the period that kind of started the modern times, especially in Europe. The term Renaissance is a word that means rebirth. So it's like a rebirth of culture, rebirth of art, rebirth in civilization, science, math, all kinds of culture in general that affected, Europe later. Architecture, you could pretty much name anything. Paintings, obviously, were influenced by it also as well. They do think that the Renaissance was heavily influenced by Greco-Roman culture. They talk about this so-called classical revival, that occurs in the late Middle Ages, where a lot of scholars began to kind of restudy the past. They looked at all this old pagan stuff that had been there, like writings and so on, literature, history, and whatever. And they began to restudy it And the men that did that, or women that did that, became what they call humanists. So you get this so-called Renaissance humanism movement that kind of takes off. And humanism was a type of scholarly movement where there was a revival in classical antiquity, where they began to restudy, like I said, like these things of the past. Whether they're reading, Plutarch and Herodotus and other types of authors that had existed a long time ago in general. And the father of the Renaissance and also the father of humanism is the Italian writer Petrarch, who lived in the 1300s. They think he was one of the first to really restudy the past, like all the pagan literature that had been around. I think he even started to translate it into different language, like Italian or whatever, so people could read it in their vernacular type language. So that's something you start seeing, like in Italy, they start writing in like Italian instead of like, say, Latin, more or less. And so that gave birth to what we call afterwards, a lot of things. They start calling this the so-called humanities that develop. And you start seeing people study all kinds of things of the past. They start studying, history, philosophy, poetry, literature, and so on. That was from like a long time ago. That was there because a lot of that had been prevented by the Catholic Church. They didn't want you to read certain things like that. But in Italy, they began to kind of, look at that more. Historians believe that the Renaissance started mostly in Florence. Florence is kind of seen as the birthplace of the Renaissance, like the Tuscany area, which is like northern Italy, basically. And Florence was, by the way, was the capital of what they call the Florence Republic, which was considered one of the most influential republics at that time in early modern times. Florence became, by the way, the medieval center of European trade. That's one thing it was known for. In fact, through finance, the so-called Florentine money, which is called the florin, about that, was almost like the dollar today. That's how powerful their money was in general. They believe how the Renaissance got started was that they had these wealthy families, like you've heard of the Medici family. It's like well known, of course, in Florence, Italy. They think what happened was they made a lot of money off of trade, and they took that wealth and they started patronizing, artists in general. And so that's what led to the beginning of, they think, the Renaissance. So they've spent like millions of dollars, artwork, statues and paintings and building buildings and so on. And they think that's how the Renaissance got going overall. And I think they say that the Florence and other these Italian cities like Venice and so on, Genoa, they all became wealthy because of like the Asian trade with the East due to the impact of the Crusades and the Silk Road and all that. And so that's what kind of caused it, later. The Renaissance is usually subdivided, by the way. They have the so-called early Renaissance, which the early Renaissance is mostly 14th, 15th century, I guess, is the peak of it, predominantly, mostly in Italy, northern Italy, more than anything. High Renaissance also as well is kind of like early 16th century as well. That was the peak of Renaissance art in general. And that's where you get all these famous artists like Da Vinci, Michelangelo. They kind of have the peak of their artwork at the time. They also have the so-called Northern Renaissance, when what happened was the Renaissance spread from Italy to the rest of Europe, and it went into like, Germany, France, England, and other countries, throughout Europe as well. The Northern Renaissance, by the way, affected, they think, the age of discovery. Like Christopher Columbus was a Renaissance man. If you know about that, of course. They think it influenced like William Shakespeare, stuff like that. Geoffrey Chaucer, of course, wrote their different works, of course, later. They do think the Renaissance affected the Reformation also as well. Because, you got the John Gutenberg, invents the printing press and all that. And that also affected, the world as well later. Now, of course, we'll get into and talk about, the so-called High Renaissance. You got all these different, the peak period of the High Renaissance you see there with these different artists here. But you got, these masters you're looking at, of course, in that picture, you've got, Raphael, Sanzio, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. Those are all considered some of the great artists that were part of the high Renaissance that were there. I didn't talk about all the different artists. Before I get into them, let me mention about some of the other artists that were also well known before them. I've got a bunch of them here I can kind of share with you that were, I think these were more into the early Renaissance that you had as well. But you had like, don't forget about Dante. I forgot about him. Dante's kind of an important, artist in the Renaissance. I think they consider him to be the greatest Renaissance poet, especially in Italian. Of course, we wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 1300s. And his was actually one of the first works that was written in like vernacular of Italian, Tuscany type languages. And so his work, the Divine Comedy, was this medieval work where it kind of gave you kind of this medieval view of the afterlife, heaven, hell, and purgatory, and all that. And so his work was kind of influential. They think he was heavily influenced by some of the earlier epics like the Aeneid, by Virgil and things like that from a long time ago. So a lot of these artists are kind of copying some of the old Greco-Roman type artists from a long time ago. Giovanni Picacio, of course, they talked about in the little video, of course, another famous writer, poet who's well known as well. He wrote Decameron, which was a series of novellas that were associated with the backdrop of the Black Death and all that. So he kind of survived the Black Death. He was from Florence. And so he was another great writer that's well known as well. Donatello, of course, Italian sculptor in the 1400s. He's also pretty important. He influenced other sculptors like Michelangelo later to kind of develop their art as well. One thing about the Italian sculptors, they started to use more nudity in a lot of their statues. And that's something that they were heavily influenced by Greek-Roman statues from a long time ago. So you start seeing them copying that and all that. He had an early version of the statue of David that's not as well known as the one by Michelangelo, but he's got one that's well known as well. I'll mention Machiavelli also as well. He's another famous figure in the Renaissance as well. He was an Italian writer and diplomat. And he of course, lived in the Republic of Florence. And he was known for his famous treatise, which was the Prince, written in the 1530s. And it was considered one of the first modern political treatises on how rulers can, rule in general, like how to stay in power and things like that. And so that particular book was highly influential in influencing a lot of political theory among monarchs of Europe at the time and later. It's still influential today. You will still read that book and they're still influenced by it overall. So I was kind of mentioning some of these a lot of those were in the early Renaissance that were involved there. But of course, you've got the ones I was going to talk about next, of course, which is the high Renaissance ones that you've got here, of course. Yeah, those are, of course, the most famous overall of the Renaissance artists that, of course, they're right there. I think they say Michelangelo, the one on the far right, is considered the most famous of them all. But yeah, I'll first talk about Da Vinci. Da Vinci, of course, was considered one of the greatest artists, of the high Renaissance. He's known for a lot of famous paintings that people still, of course, look up to today. Which you can see there, one of the most famous he did was the Mona Lisa, which is now in the Louvre. But he's also known for the Last Supper, which is a fresco painting that's now, of course, in Milan. But he was known for all kinds of things. That's one thing about Da Vinci. Da Vinci was kind of this polymath, that was a painter, he was a sculptor, he was an engineer, architect. He invented things. If you ever read the Da Vinci notebooks, you can see he had all kinds of crazy ideas. Like, I think he had ideas of developing airplanes and helicopters and things like that before anybody else kind of created those ideas. So he was kind of a man that was ahead of his time and all that. But Da Vinci was kind of this perfectionist that couldn't finish his paintings, and most of his paintings were never finished, if you know about that, about Da Vinci. There's the Last Supper painting, of course, which has been done, kind of redone, I think. They've had to fix it up over the years. But it depicts basically Jesus at the Last Supper, when at the point when he says that one of his disciples, has basically betrayed him, which of course is, Judas. So anyway, so yeah, you got that. Da Vinci, the famous master artist, of course, known for the Mona Lisa in general. Also, of course, you don't forget you have David, of course, the statue of David with Michelangelo. That's probably his greatest thing he's known for, as you know. Michelangelo was predominantly a sculptor and painter. He was from, of course, Florence as well. And he's known for a lot of things. He, of course, was primarily known as a sculptor. I think that's what he saw himself first as, more or less. But he was also a great painter as well, famous for painting the Sistine Chapel, in Rome, which I've got kind of a painting of that as well. Of course, as you know, he painted most of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Here's an example of the so-called creation of Adam, which is on the ceiling right there. Later, he also did, which is like a little later, he did the so-called Last Judgment, which is behind the altar in the Sistine Chapel. As well, I think that was done later, I want to say around the 1530s. And why is the Sistine Chapel important? Well, it's important because the fact that that's where about the Catholic Church, the cardinals will choose who the next pope is. That's why they go there to elect the next pope and all that. And so that's why that chapel is kind of important at St. Peter's and all that in Rome. Now, anyway, so yeah, you got Michelangelo, of course, very famous for his work as well. Another great master, I guess I'll mention about that I usually kind of talk about, Raphael Sanzio. He's another famous painter that was also big, everybody's heard about in the Renaissance. He was from Urbino in Italy, and he also was involved in painting the Sistine Chapel as well. So you got other artists like him that were involved in it. He's known for like paintings like depictions of the Virgin Mary. They usually show her images like there with baby Jesus usually holding him or something like that. And of course, he calls him Madonna. I think is the term the Italians use sometimes for the Virgin Mary and all that. So you got that painting that's kind of well known as well. I think that other painting, the Madonna, the chair, is well known as well. But the painting that's more famous today that they usually talk about, that he's kind of real famous for, Sanzio, Raphael Sanzio, of course, is the so-called School of Athens, which depicts the Academy of Ancient Greece, where I think in the middle of the painting you've got Plato, right here next to Aristotle and other famous people that were part of, ancient Greece at the time. That's, I guess, in the so-called 4th century BC and all that. So yeah, that's kind of basically, some of these great artists that were, part of the, Renaissance that's there. But yeah, they have that, and you have the Northern Renaissance, of course, that spread later into Europe and all that. And so, yeah, the Renaissance, they think, helped to create the more modernized Europe that would follow afterwards. Like I said, you've got these other artists that were affected too. Like you've got Geoffrey Chaucer. I say Geoffrey Chaucer, was a highly influential, in the 15th century. He of course, was seen as the so-called father of English literature, English poetry afterwards because of him. And then you got William Shakespeare, one of the greatest playwrights in any language that you had, that was also kind of part of the later part of the Renaissance as well. I think some people also talk about Erasmus. You ever heard of him in Germany? He was also big in the Northern Renaissance as well, of Dutch origins. So you have all these different people that were kind of affected by it. And even, like I said, Christopher Columbus was, like I said, a Renaissance man in general. So Anyway, so yeah, like that's pretty much my lectures, of course, on the Middle Ages. If you have any, of course, comments, questions, of course, about that, about really all the lectures, of course, on the Middle Ages, of course, let me know later on my channel. Don't look like there's any comments today. I got questions more or less about this lecture or previous lectures, but like I said, this is pretty much going to wrap up the semester of my lectures.